Hello, welcome to my spring bean creation demo. In this video, I'm going to show you two ways in which you can create beans in Spring. If you remember from the previous video, Spring's main responsibility is creating singleton beans and managing them. So let's get to it. Here I have created a simple Maven project. All I have inside this project is a class with a main method in it. And as you can see, I have annotated this class with the @Spring Boot application annotation, which initializes the Spring container and basically makes my application a Spring application, an application managed by Spring. So, as I mentioned before, I'm going to demonstrate two ways of creating spring beans. Beans, if you remember, are nothing but simple POJOs, plain Java objects, and basically they're the objects that your application needs throughout its lifetime. So, Spring is going to be in charge of creating those beans and managing them. So the first method that I'm going to show you for creating beans is using a Java configuration file. So before I show you how you define a configuration file, I want to create a couple of classes. So let's create two classes, one simple service and one simple repository. So I'm going to define simple service here. And all I'm going to put inside simple service is a constructor. I'm going to generate a constructor, and all I'm going to put inside this constructor is a print statement so that I know when it's called. And let's say creating the service bean. Okay, so that's done. And then let's create a simple repository. And again, all I'm going to do here is create a constructor and put a print statement inside. Creating the repository bean. Okay, so that's all. So I have two classes, and I want Spring to create two beans. So one instance of simple service and one instance of simple repository. And save it for me. When Spring creates beans, it saves them in something called the Spring context. It's where all the beans are placed, and whenever I need them throughout the life cycle of my application, Spring is able to fetch them and pass them on to me. So now that I have my classes, I want to create the beans, which are instances of these classes. So I'm going to create a configuration file and define the beans inside the configuration class. So I'm going to call this simple config. All you need to do to mark a class as a configuration class is to add this annotation @configuration. Once you add this to a class, Spring knows this is where it needs to go to find the bean definitions. So now we can start creating our bean definitions. For that, you have to use this annotation @bean. That's a method level annotation and indicates to bean whatever the method returns, treat it as a bean. So I'm going to write a method that returns a simple service. And let's call it get simple service, or get simple service bean. And all I'm going to do inside is create a new instance of simple service and return it. So return new simple service. So that's all. This method just calls the constructor of simple service and returns a new instance. Now because this method is defined as a bean, the return value of this method is defined as a bean, this is going to be by default a singleton bean. So this constructor will only get called once throughout the lifetime of your application, whenever you need a simple service bean, it will fetch and return the same instance. And then similarly, I'm going to create a repository bean. So again, I have to write a method that returns an instance of a repository class. So simple repository. All I'm going to do is return a new repository instance. Yeah, that's all. So here I have a configuration file that has 2 beans defined in it. So now if I run my app, let's look at the main method again. So whenever the main method is run, well, at the end it will print hello world to indicate that the main method was run, but hopefully now that I have defined a configuration file and defined 2 beans in it, upon the startup of the application, these 2 beans will also get created without me having to call the constructor as I'm running my app. So let's run the app and see what happens. So here, as you can see, the constructor for the service bean was called, the constructor for the repository bean was called. That means both beans are created, and then at the end hello world is printed because that's what I had in my main method. So without making any calls to the constructors of these 2 classes, the beans got created. Why? Because I defined a configuration class and defined the 2 beans in them. Whenever you have a configuration file, at startup, Spring will go to the configuration file and will create all the beans. Okay, so this was the first method. Now, instead of using a configuration file, I want to just use annotations, which is an alternative way for creating beans. So let me just comment out this entire class. We're not going to use this anymore. And now if I run my application, you'll see the beans won't get created, and all you will see is a hello world print statement. Here we go. We just got the hello world without the beans being created. Now, to create beans without using Java config, we can use annotations called stereotype annotations, and there's 4 of them. There's @service, @repository, @controller, and @component. They're actually all equivalent. In the eyes of Spring, they're all the same as @component, which creates a new component or a new bean. So, the @service and @repository are more informative for the human reader because you know what type of bean is being created. So I'm going to use an @service annotation for my service class, @repository for my repository class, and that's all I have to do. Placing this annotation on the repository class marks it as a bean, and placing this annotation on the simple service class marks it as a bean. So as soon as you start the application, Spring knows that it needs to create a simple service bean, save it in the Spring context, which is where all the beans get saved, and when you place this annotation, it knows it has to create a repository bean. So let's stop and rerun the application, and again, note that my config file configuration class is commented out, so it's not being used. Let's rerun this, and hopefully the beans will get created again. And they are here, creating the repository bean, creating the service bean. So just placing a simple annotation on a class marks it as a class that needs to be instantiated as a bean at the startup of the application. So this is how you can create all the beans using the Spring container. In the next video, I will show you dependency injection, constructor injection, and setter injection, and field injection. So stay tuned. Thank you.